So in this retreat, Shamatha retreat, we saw that where this Shamatha practice fits in the bigger picture within Buddhism, that it's one of the three core areas of practice, that on the basis of ethics, avoiding harmful behaviour, we engage in the concentration practice, or sometimes called Shamatha practice. On that basis, we engage in the wisdom practice, the Vipassana practice, to gain an insight into nature of reality. But this wisdom practice needs to be balanced with the other main area of practice. And so sometimes we talk about what's called the two wings of practice. In Sanskrit, the first one is called prajna, which is wisdom. And the other wing of practice is, in Sanskrit, upaya, sometimes translated as method or sometimes translated as skillful means. And so this is really talking about how we act in the world. And of course, all of our actions are to be based on compassion. So sometimes this wing here is called the compassion wing. So these are often likened to the two wings of a bird. That a bird needs two wings to fly to a certain destination. Likewise, if we want to go to the destination of liberation from suffering and genuine happiness, we need both wings of wisdom and compassion. So therefore we see this sort of three core areas of practice that sort of on the basis of ethics, we first engage in Shamatha practice to cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind. And then on that basis, we engage in these two practices of wisdom and compassion. And particularly here in the context of Shamatha practice, if we don't engage in these two practices as complementary practices for Shamatha, you'll find that there'll be difficulties with Shamatha practice. In particular, if we don't engage in any Vipassana practice, you'll find that you'll come up against a lot of obstacles, particularly in terms of our mental afflictions like craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, frustration, and so forth. These are very strong and they create obstacles in our Shamatha practice. Whereas the Vipassana practice, as we're going to look at in day 9 of this retreat, is starting to cut these mental afflictions. So if we engage in some Vipassana practice while we're doing the Shamatha, this Vipassana will start to cut these mental afflictions a little bit, which means that we'll be able to go deeper into the Shamatha practice, so they sort of work together. Similarly, with the compassion wing of practice, if we don't engage in that together with Shamatha, then there can be very much a danger that we simply use the Shamatha practice as a way of withdrawing from the world. Because there's a lot of big mess out there. And what we'll find is if we only do Shamatha practice and we start to cultivate this much more calm, peaceful mind, we'll go, oh, that's nice, I like that. And we'll just simply withdraw more and more into that as a way of getting away from that mess out there. That's not a very healthy thing to do, because we'll become very disconnected from the world. So therefore, this shamatha practice is not about withdrawing from the world. It's really giving us the ability to be better in the world. So to help us to do that, it's very important to bring in some compassion practice into our practice so we can avoid that going in that direction. And so that's what we're going to do now in each session after lunch. We're going to move into this compassion wing of practice. And there's a number of different qualities that we're cultivating, and we'll look at some of those in the coming days. But today I'd like to simply look at the first quality that we're cultivating in the compassion wing of practice, and that is the quality of loving kindness. And here the word loving kindness is a translation of the Sanskrit term Maitri and the Pali term Metta. And these are simply defined as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. So what we see here is that Maitri and Metta, which here we're translating as loving kindness, is not an emotion. Because sometimes this Maitri and Metta is translated as love. But I think this can be a bit misleading. Because for us in the English language, love is definitely an emotion, and it often implies some sort of intimate behaviour. Whereas here, Maitri and Metta are not an emotion. They're an aspiration, they're a wish, an aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. So therefore I think it's more helpful to translate Maitri and Metta as loving kindness. Now, of course, most of us already have an aspiration or wish to be happy. But often our aspiration for happiness is a little bit misdirected. Meaning that not only don't we tend to find happiness, but even in the search for happiness, we often induce a lot of unnecessary suffering upon ourselves and often to the people around us. And this is very succinctly put by, again, this great Indian master Shantideva from the 8th century, who says, "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." So therefore, if we want to cultivate loving kindness for ourselves and others, this wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes, then of course we need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes. Because if we don't know those three things, loving kindness is just words with no meaning. So let's have a look at those 3 points. What is happiness? What are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes? So first is, what is happiness? We can talk about 2 types of happiness. The first type is what's called temporal happiness, and this is simply another name for our pleasurable experiences. So this is what's called a stimulus-based happiness. that we receive some stimulus, and the stimulus can be external or internal, some stimulus, and then we have some pleasant experience. Therefore, this is often what's called conditioned happiness. We need certain conditions to come together for us to have this pleasurable experiences. And therefore, this happiness is transient, meaning temporary, because as soon as the stimulus finishes, the happiness experience finishes. But also, therefore, it's unreliable, because we can't just click our fingers and have a pleasant experience whenever we want one. No stimulus, no pleasant experience. And if we look closely at our pleasurable experiences, they're not really even in the nature of happiness. Because if our pleasurable experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean that the more we engaged in them, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience that often when we overindulge in our pleasant experiences, not only don't they make us more happy, often they induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. For example, eating too much of our favourite dessert, spending too long out in the nice warm sunshine. So what we can understand from this is that these pleasurable experiences are relative experiences. That relative to an earlier state, they're an improvement, but if you engage in them too much, they themselves can turn into suffering. So this is one type of happiness. And in Buddhism, a second type of happiness is identified. And that is what's called genuine happiness, this state of inner well-being. This is not a stimulus-based happiness, meaning we don't require any particular stimulus to be in this state. So we can be in this state of inner well-being regardless of what's going on around us. So therefore, this is called unconditioned happiness. We don't need certain conditions to be there for us to be in that state. And therefore, by its nature, it's stable, it's reliable, and it is in the nature of happiness. And this genuine happiness, or inner well-being, comes about through being in harmony with the interdependent nature of reality. And we'll look at that, what that really means much later in this retreat on the 9th day when we look at the Vipassana practice. So when we talk about the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes, we're mainly, of course, talking about the second one. Now, of course, we tend to conflate these two, meaning now we often hope that the first one will give us the second one. We're often hoping that our pleasurable experiences are going to fulfill us and last, and we be fulfilled by those pleasurable experiences. And because of that, we end up with craving and attachment for those pleasant experiences. We're trying to grab them and we're trying to hold on to them and sort of try and make them last. But of course, that attachment only brings suffering. Because generally, with that craving and attachment, which already tends to agitate the mind, often together with that craving and attachment comes worry and anxiety about not getting it, not getting enough of it, or losing it. And then, of course, if we don't get the thing we want, we often have a lot of frustration. And even if we do get the thing we want, we sometimes overindulge in it and then just have suffering. And then, of course, when that pleasurable experience finishes, we often end up with a lot of dissatisfaction and disappointment when things don't really live up to our expectations. And then, of course, when we lose it, we tend to get upset. And then, of course, we often feel like the reason I'm not really happy is I just didn't get enough of that. I just need more of it. And so we end up in this vicious cycle of more and more craving, more and more attachment. It's a little bit like drinking salty water to try and quench the thirst. The more we drink, the more thirsty we become. But also, the other thing that happens with craving and attachment is, of course, craving and attachment is never satisfied. Which means, actually, we end up not enjoying the things we used to enjoy. Because at some point, craving and attachment goes, that's not good enough anymore. Because I need something bigger, better, and different. And so we lose, actually, enjoyment of the things we used to enjoy because of the craving and attachment. So therefore, if we can understand there are actually two types of happiness, the temporal happiness, pleasurable experiences, and understand that these are never going to fulfill us and they're never going to last because they're stimulus-based, they're conditioned. And then if we can identify this genuine happiness, this inner well-being, then we can strive for that state of genuine happiness and actually at the same time enjoy simple pleasures in life much more. And here there's sometimes some confusion we have when people hear about this. Because often when we talk about this striving for this genuine happiness, in Buddhism, often there's a word presented which says that we have to develop this what's called renunciation. And this word renunciation means to give up. And so this is the aspiration that we are to cultivate. We'll look at this in a bit more detail later in the retreat. But it's said that this is the aspiration we are to cultivate, to strive for genuine happiness. This renunciation, this renouncing. And then it's often presented in terms of giving up what are called the 8 worldly concerns. And the 8 worldly concerns are these pairs of like pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, and good reputation, bad reputation. So often it's presented in terms of, giving up these concerns in terms of gain, in terms of wealth, pleasure, praise and good reputation. So then people mistakenly think that if I'm going to strive for genuine happiness, I have to give up enjoying simple pleasures in life. But that's not what's being said. Renunciation is not giving up the 8 worldly things, but it's giving up the 8 worldly concerns. So here the word concern means the belief that pleasure will give us happiness, that money, wealth, pleasure, praise, and so forth is going to guarantee us happiness. In other words, what we are to give up here is craving and attachment to pleasures. And so therefore, if we can give up that craving and attachment, understanding that our pleasurable experiences are never going to fulfill us, satisfy us, and understand that there is this state of genuine happiness, inner well-being, and if we strive for that, then what you're going to find is that you'll enjoy the simple pleasures in life much more than you do now. Because it's actually our craving and attachment which interferes with our enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life. Because sometimes people feel like it's a choice. Either I choose pleasure or I choose genuine happiness. It's not a choice. It's understanding there are two types, and if we strive for this genuine happiness, as a byproduct, we'll actually enjoy our pleasurable experiences much more than we do now. Any questions so far? So remember, in the afternoon sessions, I'm going to be more interactive. So as we go along, if there's any questions, just raise your hand and I'll answer them as we go.
Where does something like, say somebody's a musician, right? And he practices playing music, he enjoys it. So is this a temporal condition pleasure?
Yes, yes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a bit later in this session. But any pleasurable experience, of course, is this. Yeah. And again, we're not saying there's anything wrong with that. In fact, let's enjoy pleasurable experiences fully. But to understand that pleasurable experiences are never going to fulfill us. And they're not reliable because they need conditions. And if we have craving and attachment for it, we're going to suffer a lot. For example, if you're a musician, and one night we're playing very well, and we really think, oh, that's wonderful, but then we have craving and attachment for that high level of playing, maybe we try to recreate that and get frustrated and get upset with ourselves when we're not performing at that level. And that's just going to make more suffering.
The reason I ask is that what part of the happiness is stemming from is that you are improving over time. So a great musician over time is not going to have the same pleasure as he had 10 years ago from just playing something simple. He's sort of like, I don't know, for me it's like he's also like being spiritual, like he's training himself to get better. Once he's better, that pleasure is stemming from getting better.
Right. But here the key point, and that's one of the key points between these two, is what is our perspective? Here, our perspective really is, what can I get from the world? What can I get? Whereas this is about, what can I bring to the world? So if you're a musician and you have this perspective, I suggest you're going to get very frustrated, not be happy with yourself. And whereas if you have this perspective, you'll strive to improve, but your motivation is, I want to bring more to the world. I want to inspire others. That's great. Then the happiness is not so much about, I did so fantastically well. It's about, what did I give to the world? That's the key.
So motivation is the key?
Motivation is key in everything, And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. Of course, yeah. Okay. So that's happiness. What are the causes of happiness? So causes of happiness, and what I mean by happiness now, of course, is genuine happiness, is what we've seen already. These three core areas of practice. Is initially, of course, to adopt an ethical lifestyle, to avoid harmful behaviour. And on that basis, we engage in the concentration practice, the Shamatha practice, which, of course, is the main part of this retreat, is the Shamatha practice. And then on that basis, we engage in the wisdom practice, sometimes referred to as Vipassana practice, to come to an insight into the nature of reality. Because the Buddhist assertion is that it's our distorted view of reality that is the underlying root cause of our mental afflictions and suffering. So if we want to overcome our mental afflictions and suffering and find this state of genuine happiness of inner well-being, we need to come to this insight into nature of reality. And to come to this insight into nature of reality, we need shamatha. Because here we're talking about a direct insight into nature of reality in meditation. And to have that, we need a very calm, clear, focused mind. We need the mind of shamatha. And I'll talk more about that relationship between these two a little bit later in this retreat. So therefore, if we understand these two types of happiness, particularly understand this idea of genuine happiness, and that the causes for genuine happiness are these three core areas of practice, and that if we then practice these practices of ethics, shamatha, vipassana, of course together with compassion, then we can really achieve that state of genuine happiness. So then we know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes, because we will understand how to practice these two practices of shamatha and vipassana. Then loving kindness has some meaning. Then having this wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes will lead us to enact those. That loving kindness for ourselves will lead us to striving in these practices to strive for the state of genuine happiness. And this aspiration of loving kindness for others will lead to us helping others to also engage in these sorts of practices to help them also to find that genuine happiness. Now, when we're practicing this loving kindness, it's recommended we do it in stages. And traditionally in the meditation texts, 4 stages are mentioned. That is, first we cultivate loving kindness to our friends because it's most easy. Then we expand that out to include the so-called strangers, the people we don't know very well. Once we're comfortable with that, then we expand it out to include people, the difficult people, the so-called enemy, the people we don't like. And then eventually to expand it out to all living beings. So these are usually the 4 steps that are mentioned in the text. But I think in the modern world we need to add one more step right at the beginning. Normally you won't see in the meditation text, and that is to cultivate loving kindness for ourselves. Because I think historically people tended to feel okay about themselves, but I think in the modern world that's often not the case. In fact, often we're suffering from low self-esteem and even self-hatred. So therefore,